one of the APOC associations. And the assumption, I suppose, by the applicant was that they would be able to use that land, some kind of agreement, and then be able to then put the sidewalk onto that land. It turned out that they didn't have such permission, and so the evidence is simply the drawings that were approved in 2020 that showed that adding the turn lane pushes the sidewalk onto private property that they don't own. So there is insufficient right-of-way. They also cite a Palm Beach County requirement that was stated in an August 2019 traffic performance standards letter. That letter has been superseded by a November 2021 letter that does not include that requirement. The applicant, worked with the county and convinced the county that that wasn't a requirement, so that is just not a basis. They also talked about the removal of, or I don't know if it's a removal, but the non-requirement of a deceleration lane at southbound Congress to 65th Street, citing section 2817.19.2H, would encourage through traffic. But 65th Street is a cul-de-sac. There is no such thing as through traffic on a cul-de-sac. All the traffic is, unless it's a mistake, is presumably going to one of the properties that accesses 65th Street. So that just wasn't logical. It doesn't make any sense. With respect to the matrix, I know when we considered this item in 2020, I tried to kind of explain this, but it was difficult, probably more difficult then because we were virtual and it was just a more difficult format. Generally, the PMD matrix allows the city council to interpret to a large degree what is, in many cases, considered to be, for example, an excellent, a good, or a poor spatial distribution of uses. So what city staff has done since this PMD ordinance was passed in 2012 is we have developed a series of more detailed standards so that we give consistent recommendations based on clear standards. So things like buildings must open to more than 50% of buildings must open to a street is something that we have added in terms of our recommendations, not something the city council is bound by, but simply because so that city staff can make consistent recommendations. So what does it mean for buildings to open to a street? We believe it means that the entrance faces the street. And no, that doesn't mean a street in Europe. It means a street that borders the property. I mean, that's logical and just common sense. Mr. Ungen argues that, we're measuring distances from parking to building entrances that are not a main entrance because there's a, whatever you call this, basically signs stuck in the window that says not an entrance or use the other entrance. That could be taken down tomorrow. I mean, to use that as a basis in a planning, decision just doesn't make any sense. In terms of the complementary uses, yes, we're using as the crow flies, as they say, for complementary uses because that is the precedent that we've used in every PMD approval dating back 10 years now, 8 years, whatever it is. Again, the city council is not bound by that. They can simply choose to say this is excellent, good, or poor. We're trying to give you logical reasons why we believe they've met, the points that we have recommended. The idea that there's no entrance here that's good for construction or that's made for construction. Well, that's essentially the case on every property throughout the city. You don't build your driveways for construction purposes. You construct and then you finish the driveway so that it's in its permanent configuration after construction. By the way, how construction will be carried out to minimize impacts is something that will be reviewed at permit. We do a lot in that way in review of a building permit for such a major redevelopment, and we do our best, but nobody can promise that you're going to build a 277-unit apartment building and have no negative impacts. Many people know that if the neighbor next door rebuilds their house, it's going to impact you. That's life. With respect to the size of the property and including the commercial buildings in the redevelopment, yes, that is allowed. Yes, the owners have consented to that. Yes, the owners of the portion of the property where the apartment won't be built have decided to give up their future development rights for whatever consideration might have been given. That's allowed. There's nothing that's not allowed by that. Our traffic engineers might wish to address some of the other items specific to traffic that I'm not able to address, but those are the things that I jotted down. If there's any other specific questions, I'm happy to give it a shot.
Thank you. Mr. Thomson?
Could you address the questions with respect to the comp plan and whether the approval of it would violate the comprehensive plan?
We do extensively review development applications against the policies of the comprehensive plan. We did not find that they would violate any of those provisions. I haven't seen these specific contentions before, so it's hard for me to address. We could bring them back up, and I could try if that's something we want to do.
Okay, thank you. Further questions of staff? All right, anything else you want to add? Because then Mr. Thomson.
I had one more, and it related to you mentioned that there was a right-of-way constraint, and we saw language in the code that discusses in the event of a right-of-way constraint that there's some other contingency that can be satisfied. Has that been satisfied here?
Yes, it has. So thank you for that. Basically, what it says is if you don't have sufficient right-of-way to provide the deceleration lane, that there's a bigger turning radius required, and they have met that requirement in their plans.
Further questions of staff? All right, seeing none, this is an opportunity for cross-examination. If you'd like to cross-examine, please rise and then let me know who you'd want to cross-examine. Mr. Abrams, you can stand by the microphone.
Thank you. I guess I'll first direct some questioning to, is it Brandon Shedd?
It is.
It is. And
thank you.
I will tell you that our normal practice is for 3 minutes total of cross-examination. So why don't let's bear that in mind, please.
Thank you.
We've been lenient on other things, so as well.
I understand. Thank you. I'll do the best I can. I don't really have that much. Mr. Shedd, does the code provide that the right-of-way constraint exists if a property owner doesn't own the property? I mean, if the applicant doesn't own the property?
No, it says, in fact, if the applicant did own the property, then we would require them to dedicate it. So it's implied.
But isn't that private property that you referenced the subject of this planned mobility development application before the commission today?
No, it's not.
Isn't the entire site being taken into account in the density calculation?
Yes, it is, but the deceleration lane would would push the sidewalk into encroach on the property that's not owned by the applicant, that's not part of the PMD approval, that's owned by forgive me, I forget the name of one of the APOC associations.
Did the city request negotiations for the applicant to purchase that property?
What we did was we contacted the association ourselves. We had the applicant make the formal request to the association as well. And I honestly had every expectation that they would grant the request. I was very surprised when they voted it down.
Do you think that the responsibility should be on the applicant to secure the sufficient amount of right-of-way in order to meet that turn lane requirement in the code?
I think that the responsibility should be on the applicant to comply with the code.
Okay. Is it the city's regular practice to allow for an entire planned mobility development site to be included for purposes of density calculation, but not also hold the entire site accountable for the purposes of right-of-way?
No, and that's not what we're doing here either.
Is a city traffic official here today?
City traffic engineers are here, yes.
Okay. Do they have they disputed any of the findings that Mr. Perez testified to today?
We just heard what he had to say a few minutes ago. I don't have an answer to that.
Do you dispute any of the findings that Mr. Perez testified to today?
Give me a second. Based on what I jotted down of what he said, I am not qualified to say one way or the other.
Okay. Regarding the main entrance issue, or I'm sorry, regarding the complementary uses issue, is the distance properly measured by what is walkable or by what is the way the crow flies method? If you could address that.
There is one standard that, again, is something that the staff uses in formulating our recommendations that does use an as the crow flies standard. There are separate and distinct portions of the matrix that also have a points available that measure, I believe it's in front of me, average pedestrian trip between complementary uses and average bike trip between complementary uses.
But isn't the point of the complementary use mobility matrix factor to encourage walkability?
It is, and I suppose that's probably why those two additional standards are there.
Then why was as a crow flies used?
That, again, there's two different standards. There's one that uses as the crow flies, and there's one that uses the average walking trip and bicycling trip. Again, the council is free to feel differently about it, but we have consistently used the same standard for every PMD project that's been reviewed.
Well, which measurement did the city take here?
We didn't take any measurements. The applicant did.
The city doesn't independently verify?
We review what they submit.
Okay. And the city relied on an as a crow flies method?
For the one standard that awards points in that category, we did. I reviewed that, as Mr. Ungen is aware, quite extensively. I took weeks to understand and review it. I looked at all the data. I worked with the applicant to understand the data. Again, reviewed it for many hours and ultimately concluded that it was properly done and came up with a recommendation that I think is sound, and we've applied it consistently.
Okay, final question for you. Do the increased traffic from the Amtech project, does that directly affect the level of traffic that will be experienced in front of the property owned by Millennium at 6501?
I would have to imagine it does.
No further questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. Abrams.
How much am I into this? Six
Yeah,
minutes?
you're already at 6 minutes beyond the 3, yeah.
You guys have been, okay. Can I get just 1 minute of questioning in since I'm not allowed to do direct, I would like to cross Mr. Perez if that would be permitted.
It is permitted under the rules. It says any other person who's spoken, so yes.
Okay, thank you.
I would just like to clarify for the record, you had some questions that you had on traffic. Do you want to put those on the record? And to the extent our traffic engineer chooses to respond or the council requests that he respond, we can deal with that. But if you want to put those on the record, that would allow us to address that.
Yeah, that would be fine with me.
All right, why don't you state the questions, and then we can have our traffic engineer, ready to write them down. How many do you have, or a whole series?
Okay, I'm sorry, not necessarily, he's not going to answer them now.
I just want,
If you'll put your questions in the record, then we'll have them all in the record, and the traffic engineer can respond if deemed appropriate by the council.
Okay. Well, the main question was whether the amount of increased traffic on Congress Ave does in fact require a right turn lane into the main entrance of Congress Ave. I think that's not really in dispute anyways, but that's the main question.
okay. Would you like to respond? Then thank you. If you'll find, I don't know if we have a handheld mic or if someone will share a chair. Thank you, Ms. Rahman.
Good evening, everyone. For the record, my name is Naresh Machavarakku. I am an acting city traffic engineer. So there has been a greater detailed discussion about the removal of the deceleration lane, southbound right turn lane at the main entrance. It's been based on the city's request, it's been in the original